In starting the forum, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and their elders past, present and emerging. I'm Gail O'Brien, I'm the Executive Director of External Relations and Research, so all of the research programs actually sit in my area. I'm delighted to open the department's first research forum for 2024, sharing the deliverables from an Education Horizons grant project, how to improve wellbeing and learning for autistic students through supportive and inclusive physical environments. The community response to this research forum has been phenomenal. We've got in addition to the people in the room here, we have had about 1,000 people register to join as well online. So we've got people joining from schools and from their homes across the state. So there's clearly great interest in the findings of this project. The department is committed to supporting Queensland researchers, cutting edge research in Queensland and the delivery of research to Queensland state schools and the broader Queensland government. The Education Horizon Priority Research Grant Scheme funds Queensland-based researchers to undertake research projects that generate local evidence used by the department to deepen knowledge of our practices and help to continually improve our policies, decisions and performance. This year we will provide $1.26 million in funding for research projects as part of the current round of Education Horizons. The project being discussed today identified ways in which Queensland schools can adapt physical spaces to reduce or remove barriers and incorporate enablers to deliver an inclusive and supportive learning environment for autistic students. This project aligns with all three of the department's equity and excellence strategy focus areas. Educational achievement, we will learn about how physical environment can help or hinder optimal learning. Wellbeing and engagement, where we'll learn how physical spaces can promote a sense of belonging and comfort. And culture and inclusion, where we will learn about what an inclusive approach to a neurodiverse student population looks like. The research team have created visual resources for teachers, parents and other interested parties. These are already available on the Autism Hub website and available for use by any in our audience today. The presentation will include photographs and video footage of school environments in Queensland, where many of these suggestions have already been implemented and have had demonstrable success. We will learn how these evidence-based suggestions to make classrooms more accessible have been shown to increase accessibility for all students, not just autistic students. I commend the research team, Professor Dawn Adams, Associate Professor Kate Simpson and Dr. Stephanie Malone and Dr. Nicole Dagu for their contribution to autism research and inclusive education in Queensland and internationally, and look forward to hearing more about this research today. I would also like to thank our research services team, particularly Dr. Sheila Goff-Kenyon, who has put a phenomenal amount of work into organising today's forum, supported by Dr. Catherine McTavish, the Director of our research services team. And I would also like to thank the Autism Hub, who have graciously co-hosted the event, and we will hear from Dr. Vicky Booth following the presentation. So I will now hand over to Professor Dawn Adams to discuss the research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for allowing us the opportunity to share this work today, and I'm going to spend some time talking about the topic in general as well as the research we've done. As was mentioned, this was actually a team project between myself and the other researchers from Autism Centre of Excellence, Kate, Steph and Nicole, as well as some other research assistants, both autistic and non-autistic research assistants. So before we start, I would just like to thank everyone for being here. I know everybody has busy diaries. I know everyone has lots to do. And I know sometimes we can find it hard to come to these environments or come to talks where we might be talking about things that are uncomfortable. So I genuinely mean this. Please feel free to do whatever you need to feel comfortable to be here. We do have a reduced sensory room next door where the lights are not quite so bright. I was actually tempted to go in there. And if you want to get up, move around, make tea, make coffee, that is absolutely fine. I'm not a person who needs everyone to be seated or to sit still. If you open the biscuits, bring one up, because that's... The Autism Centre of Excellence, or ACE as we sort of summarise it, includes autistic, neurodivergent and non-autistic researchers, and that's a really, really valuable combination in the team. I am neurodivergent, but I'm not autistic, and I'm an academic and clinical psychologist. And I value hearing from the community, our community partners, autistic and autism community partners, for all our current grants. Every single grant we hold is in collaboration with a community organisation, at least one. We do receive financial support for our research from research councils and Department of Education, other government organisations, but not from pharmaceutical or genomics industries, and I just want to make that clear from the start. And as I said, this work you'll hear today was funded through one of the Queensland Department of Education Horizon grants, which was awarded in 2022. So if you want to follow the work we do in our team, we've got a Facebook page. That's usually where we summarise, lay summaries of research, videos, etc., and the formal university website. But everything we do is this interconnection between researching what autistic and autism community partners tell us they need, sharing that knowledge, such as today, and through conferences or free-to-access workshops. And in doing so, we hope that creates that connection between us as academics and as the community members out there every day working with, living with autism. So I'm going to spend a bit of time just setting the scene for the research, and some of you will know neurodiversity and autism well, but for other people it's really nice to hear a sort of up-to-date summary of where we're at with our understanding. And then I'll talk briefly around sensory processing experiences within the context of autism. That will then lead us into thinking about why we did this research and what we found, and then what the translatable findings for creating inclusive physical environments for autistic students. And we will include some real-world examples. Josiah College have given us a video of some of their way they've set the school up there, and it's really nice to see that kind of practical application to give you some inspiration for your own settings. And these findings aren't just for educational school settings. You can workplace settings, home settings, community, churches, etc. We can all create supportive and inclusive environments right from the start. So let's just take a step back and think about neurodiversity. So neurodiversity encompasses every single type of brain. So it's the big circle on the outside. And neurodiversity says that all human beings vary in the way their brains work. That means we take information in different ways, we process it in different ways, and we share our information in different ways, and we respond to that information in different ways. And a lot of the graphics you'll see in my talk, there's links or Twitter handles, etc. on there, and you can follow them on Facebook to get more information. This one comes from Embrace Autism. So neurodiversity says that there's no one right way. We all just have different ways of our brain processing and our brain varying in how they work. And so within here you'll see that the majority of brains could be classified as neurotypical, and this is just the majorative way of processing information. Outside of that, if you go to the bottom circle, we've got autistic brains. Autistic brains are part of neurodivergent brains, so brains diverge from the neurotypical. So you can be autistic and you are neurodivergent, but you can be neurodivergent but not autistic. Just as an aside, for grammatical, you cannot be neurodiverse, because that would mean you have two brains. So you can be neurodivergent, people can be neurodiverse, and you can be neurodivergent but not autistic. If you are autistic, you are neurodivergent. But if you get reading about it, it becomes very obvious. But the premise here is that neurodiversity encompasses all brain types and says no one type is better than another, no way is wrong, no way is right. And then, so the neurodiversity paradigm is the way of thinking about this. And it says that neurodiversity is a naturally occurring phenomenon, and there's variation in the way our brains work, just as there's variations in, for example, how birds appear. So would anyone say any of these birds are a better type of bird than another? Not all those birds can fly. That's okay, they're still a bird. No one says you're a useless bird, Phuket, because you can't fly. You're just a bird. Nobody says the owl, you're only awake at night. What kind of a bird are you? We see them all as birds. So just as much as any diversity is naturally occurring, neurodiversity is too. And there's no one way of being is better than another. So if we go for one type of neurodivergence, which is autism, the focus of our talk today, what is that? Well, you can read the DSM-5 and you can look through the characteristics, and I can recite those to you if you want. Not a very interesting talk, because being autistic is much more than the DSM-5. It's more because it's experienced differently by each person, and it's more because the DSM-5 tell us what to look for. It doesn't tell you what it's like from the other side, the way of being. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, is a really good website to read about. They've got a lovely way of describing what autism is and what it's like to be autistic. And they summarise it by telling us that autistic people think differently, communicate differently, socialise differently, move differently, and process their senses differently. They don't say wrong, they don't say less, they don't say more, they say differently. And it's this processing senses differently that we'll think about today. So when we think about our senses, you might think about the basic 5: touch, smell, sight, hearing, and taste. But there's more than 5. There's also body position, knowing where you are in space and time, something that I am atrocious at. Being dyspraxic, I don't know where part of my bodies are, and parts of my body could be doing things that I think they are not, and etc. And another thing, movement and balance, knowing how to stay upright, getting that feedback from your body. Now there's also a suggestion that there's an 8th sense of interoception. So many autistic and other neurodivergent people have challenges with interoception, which is identifying your body's internal signals and interpreting them. So what might be some internal signals that interoception helps us with? Anybody want to volunteer? I'm not going to pick on anyone, that's not the sort of person I am.
Hungry?
Yeah, hungry, definitely.
Needing to go to the toilet.
Needing a toilet.
Needing sleep.
Yep, feeling so hungry, sleep, tired, anger, any emotions?
I was going to say pain, but that was kind of emotions.
Yeah, no, well, pain, people don't always see pain as an emotion, so it's important to label. So reading those signs, first of all, feeling them. So that can be really difficult. You might not feel them until they're really big, which is why you're suddenly really angry or suddenly really anxious. And then interpreting them. If you find it difficult to read and interpret your signs, it's really hard to plan and manage how to respond to them. Like if you don't know you need the toilet until the last minute, it's real. You suddenly need the toilet. And when someone says, didn't you know? No. It's actually really hard to make sense of what's going on and to interpret it. And Dr. Emma Goodall, who is now runs the Office for Autism for South Australia, has lots of free resources. Emma's autistic, openly autistic, has developed lots of toolkits to help autistic and non-autistic people work on their interoception. So if this is something you're interested in, you can just Google Emma Goodall interoception, and there's lots of resources there to help you understand it better. But let's just keep our mind on those 8 possible senses. Within those 8 senses, your brain can experience them in different ways. So your brain might be hypersensitive to the sense. So that means you need less of that input to get a response from your brain. So we often think about this in terms of sound. So being hypersensitive to sound would mean that you can hear that air conditioning sound, and it's very, very intrusive for you. Being hypersensitive to smell might mean that someone's perfume is overwhelming for you. And you can be hypersensitive for any of the senses. You can also be hyposensitive, so low responses. You need more of this input to get the same response. So for example, you might be hypo-resensitive to touch, and you need a lot of input, rough and tumble play, to get that same response, or tight hugs. You could be hyposensitive to taste, and then you prefer food with intense flavours. Or a smell, if you really love the smell of candles and you need that sort of really strong sense, whereas some people might find that too much. So for each of the senses, you can be hyper-responsive, your brain can be hyper-responsive, or it can be hypo-responsive. So for example, you might be hypersensitive or hyper-responsive to sound and hypo-responsive to smell. Now to make it even more complicated, somebody's brain can be hyper-responsive to a particular sound and hypo-responsive to a particular sound. And to make it even more complicated than that, when understanding someone's profile, it can differ in different environments. So you might be able to take a certain sound at home within your context where you feel safe and comfortable, but in the context of a classroom, it's too much. So we've got different senses, we've got different responses that can vary within the responses and vary within environments. And we wonder why sensory sensitivities get misinterpreted and misunderstood. It's important to understand for each person their sensory responses and how it varies in context and time. Because sensory responses are just one element of autism, and they don't have a little part of the brain that's just for your sensory responses when you're autistic. It occurs in combination with all the other elements of autism. And earlier on when I was explaining autism, I didn't highlight why there's a colour wheel here. We don't talk about high and low functioning autism anymore. And if you want to read, there's lots of lovely articles by autistic people about why that is. We talk very much around a sort of like a colour wheel of areas of strengths and areas where a person might need more support. And we do that because someone's profile can change over time and it might be relative to environments, etc. No one person is high functioning in everything, autistic or not, and no one person is low functioning in everything, autistic or not. So when we think about sensory experiences, imagine for a moment, if you feel comfortable, being hypersensitive to and hyper-responsive to sound, and then having communication differences and not being able to recognise the feeling of discomfort and maybe having alexithymia where you can't label that. It's really hard then to explain that to someone and allow them to understand what you're experiencing. Maybe you have sensory experiences and you experience monotropism, which is a theory by Wen Lawson, which talks about, and he did a keynote at INSAR, which is the World Autism Congress, last week. He was the first openly autistic researcher to give a keynote at the World Autism Congress, which was super exciting. And his theory of monotropism says that autistic people have what he calls single channel thinking. So it's like an attention tunnel. And you can go really, really deep into this attention tunnel, and that's great if it's something you want to focus on. But if it's a sensory noise, you don't get to choose where that attention tunnel is. So if it's a sensory experience, and all you can hear is that air conditioning and all your attention is on that air conditioner, that would be really challenging and really distressing, and would help us to understand why actually these sensory experiences might be overwhelming for people. So the sensory experience doesn't happen separately from monotropism. They overlap and over-occur. So you need to take a step back and think about sensory experiences within the context of being autistic, not sensory experiences as one element which has a little part of someone's life separately. I had to add this slide in, and I'm not going to test anyone on any of the brain areas, but it was when I started doing a bit of reading about brain reaction to sensory experiences, I came across this article, which I find interesting, but I appreciate, so I'll talk you through it. But down at the bottom left of the screen there, you can see there's, apologies for the word ASD on the slides, but there's a group of children who were just anxious without autism, and there's a group of children who are autistic, but they weren't diagnosed as anxious. And in the sensory over-responsivity thing, you can see the more orange and red there is, it's the more the brain is reacting to sensory stimulus. So they give this, and this is compared to non-anxious neurotypical children. So basically, if there's more yellow and red on the brain is reacting more to the same thing. So what you can see is that for autistic children or youth, on the bottom line, if you give them the same stimulus as neurotypical children, their brain, sensory stimulus, their brain is responding more. This is not just a perception, a personal experiencing. The brain is responding more when you give the same noise as a neurotypical person, the same light, etc. So the processing is actually genuinely different. So this is really important for us to know, because there's different brain pathways and different experience going on for the same sensory response. So these experiences are real and can be seen in brain scanning as well as how people tell us. And if you're interested, those graphs at the top are heart rate response across, if you present the same stimuli lots of different time, and the green line is the autistic children on the top, and you can see they don't habituate. So if you keep if you keep giving someone the same noise, autistic children do not habituate. They do not normalize to that sound. It continues, their heart rate continues to go up, which suggests the distress continues to be experienced. So people don't just get used to it. That's basically what that graph shows. All of this aligns with what we hear from autistic adults when we ask them about sensory experience. So Kate led some work where we asked autistic adults about what impacts their well-being and when they were children, and a number of autistic adults gave us lovely examples of where sensory experiences of their life impact their well-being. And it's not just that it's not nice, you can see that the echo in the floor in the room is revolting. I'm really hot, it makes me feel sick. And indeed, if you look, this was at the INSAR conference last week, so this is new data from Rebecca Paulson, another autistic researcher at Macquarie. She asked autistic adults, and she played them sounds, she didn't tell them what they were, and she asked them to rate how overwhelming they were, anxious, fearful or disgusted. And when you play autistic adults the sounds of the classroom, you can see that they rate being more overwhelmed and more anxious by the classroom noise than they are from a leaf blower or a vacuum cleaner. So the experience carries on and remains with people, so we need to get these environments right. So I invite you, with all that in mind, that we know the sensory processing experiences are different, we know we can see it in the brains, and we can hear it from people's lived experience. I'd like you to take a minute to think about how you interpret an autistic person's sensory response. When someone shows a behaviour that tells you they're experiencing a challenging sensory response, what words do you use to describe that? What words do you use when you talk about it to the student? How do people talk about them in the staff room? And invite you to think about what that language conveys. Because there's different ways we can view sensory responses. Someone responds to a sensory stimuli, you can see it as a behaviour or a misbehaviour. So your description might be on what happens, what you see. And you describe it as a behaviour. So Mabel runs away when the light turns on. Mabel covers her ears when there's a loud noise. When you're describing a behaviour, you're suggesting a behaviour should be reduced. You don't talk about someone's sensory profile or the experience that led to that response, you just describe what you see. Maybe you describe it through a disability or diagnosis focused lens. You place a sensory response within the context of a person's autism and describe how it's incompatible with the environment. So Mabel is autistic, so finds the lights too bright in the classroom. But I invite you to take a shift. I invite you to see it through an inclusive lens, where we talk about the mismatch between the person and the environment. We're not placing the problem within the person, we're talking about how the environment doesn't fit. And by doing that, we can focus on creating environments that are supportive. So that would be something like, because the lights are bright in the classroom, or because the lights are not supportive of all neurotypes, Mabel has found a way to reduce the light by covering our eyes, because that aligns better with her sensory profile or her autistic characteristics. So you're thinking first about the environment and what's wrong with the environment, or what's mismatching an environment and a sensory profile. Then you can think about changing the environment. And this is the lens that we took in this work. So we took a standpoint of knowing that many autistic people have differences in their sensory processing. And we also know from our research that difference in sensory processing can be associated with poor academic performance and higher anxiety, lower wellness. The other piece of the puzzle is that many autistic people aren't achieving the grades that reflect their potential. Now, if we take a disability or diagnosis approach, we would just look at those things individually. But if we take this inclusive mindset, we say, well, is there a role of the physical environment in these elements of what we do know from our research? If people have differences in their sensory processing and those might lead to poor academic performance, is there a role of the physical and school environment that is making it harder for autistic people to achieve grades of their potential? Because this is our key driver. You can change the environment. You can't change an autistic person. So if we can create environments or proactively design them from the start to support autistic people and other neurodivergent students, maybe we could help young people to feel welcome, included, and able to achieve in their setting. So we searched for every single piece of published literature on this topic. So we had a lot of lovely research assistants helping our team on this, and we took a look for every piece of published research that looked at the physical and sensory element of a school environment and student learning and student wellbeing for autistic students. That means we searched through 4,297 articles, and we found 23 included studies which looked at the link between those two things together. When we found these 23 articles, we split them into these different elements that they covered. And we found that actually this is a new topic that people are beginning to look at. So 2/3 of the research has been published in the last 5 years. 2/3 of the papers actually asked autistic young people about what they think, and 1/3 only asked parents or teachers. Half of the studies use qualitative methods, so interviews, focus groups, etc., photo voice to hear detailed experiences. The rest were questionnaires. And we found that there's a lot more work needed because there's a lot of people talking about the problems, but nobody trying something and seeing if it improves outcomes. The studies that looked at noise, the most researched at this of all the areas was noise. We found 16 studies that looked at this. 14 out of the 16 studies showed you that increased noise links to poorer academic and social wellbeing outcomes for autistic students. And these studies looked at both general noise levels with like decibel readers and specific noises. And some of the quotes from the students and the teachers just give you examples of this. So, because when we're in the lesson, most of the teachers just shout at me and I don't like it, I get upset. Noise disrupts my learning. Sometimes I can't even write when it's too loud because I can't think clearly with all that distraction. So that monotropic, the noise taking over the attention. The student's name doesn't go into the playground or up on the oval because it's too noisy. He can't handle the noise. The other of the areas that had a lot of research was visual. So 12 studies looked at this. So 4 studies show that visual distractions like busy walls and things hanging from the ceilings, they reduced academic and wellbeing outcomes for autistic children. They were distracting and they didn't help them with that attention tunnel on the class. There were 4 studies, all of which showed that bright lights reduce outcomes, or fluorescent lights. And 4 on wall colours. So there was a lot of research on wall colours compared to other things, and that was very mixed results, funny enough. And the quotations were mainly around fluorescent lighting and flickering lighting. So dimming a classroom could be helpful, and he found the fluorescent lighting uncomfortable, painful at times. And we do have some of our autistic researchers will just turn the lights off in their offices because we have quite bright lights in some of the offices. And that is something that's Josiah have shown some ways they've done. And I'll bring that up in a minute. When we think about touch and space, there was looking at physical space around a person, 3 studies, 2 linking crowded space to poor outcomes, and 1 which does look at improved outcomes. It says if you give changed environment to have more working space around each student, you get better outcomes. And in touch, 3 studies found that corridor and PE, mainly games, sport were avoided due to the proximity. And that quote at the top always makes, it explains it so well. The corridors are evil. There's lots of people there, it's very noisy, and they touch you and I don't like it. Interestingly, there was only one study on smell and one on temperature, so we really can't draw conclusions there. But I find it's quite interesting because there's a lot of smells in schools, I think. So not a hard thing to research, but maybe not anyone's interest. So what can we do? Let's take ourselves back to that inclusive mindset. You can look at the response as a behaviour. You can look at a response through a disability lens, but that's not how we set up inclusive and welcoming environments. If we say there's a mismatch between what the environment is and someone's profile, and do it from this removal of the problem rather than providing accommodations on an individual need, we can make it welcoming not just for autistic students but for many other neurodivergent and other students. Because neurodiversity means that there will be different profiles, there will be different ways of thinking. We accept and we welcome different ways the brain processes information. But if we accept and welcome different ways of processing the information, that means we have to accept that there's going to be things in the environment that we can need to accommodate and change to be inclusive for all those different ways of thinking. So how do we make our environments as supportive as possible for all? And then how do we enable students to advocate or how do we help students to identify the personalised accommodations that are kind of the icing on the cake? I would say it starts with our mindset. I would say if we don't have a right mindset, we're not going to find any ways to change. Then explore the environment, that mindset, and create a plan to change. And your students will tell you as well, the ideal classroom, a school created for me would look like what? I really love NeuroWild's infographics. If you don't follow them on Facebook, it's just every day she has something amazing. And I really like this they've developed lots of things for teachers, but having that model here of a teacher setting up that it's okay for different people to have different ways to be ready to listen and ready to learn. That's where our mindset matters. The language we use, the acceptance and curiosity and empathy. Providing permission. It's not always implicit that someone can have their headphones on. You need to say that. It's not always implicit that someone could move to a different part of the classroom if it's too noisy. Listening to lived experience, if you just have to go on YouTube, podcasts anywhere, and autistic people are really keen to share their experiences with you. And when you get that mindset, you can start to celebrate diversity and difference through the way you talk about. I love the way that you've found that sitting on the ball helps you to listen. That's so creative. That's so original. I wouldn't have thought of that. That's brilliant. That's modelling that. Asking students, how can you make this space ready for learning? What can we do? What would you like to change? And inviting that. Making sure the whole class is on board, that we have different learners and different needs and different ways to feel happy and comfortable. Getting children to speak out what makes them feel comfortable, and so that it's all part of the class culture, and that you can have this lovely, the little lions going off to get the headphones for somebody else when they recognise that need in a fellow student. When you've got that mindset and you're ready to explore change and create new environments, there are some tools. So the Autism Hub website has got lots of tools on. If you haven't been there, there's lots of student voice on there as well. There's the Queensland School Autism Reflection Tool, has a whole section on creating physical environments that are inclusive for autistic students, with links to policy and resources to help you make it happen. One of the resources in there is an environmental audit. So sitting in every chair in a classroom and experiencing what the class is like from there. If you haven't sat in every chair of your classroom, how do you know what it's like to be in that class? It's not the same everywhere. There's different lights, there's different noise, there's different everything. Take it with that mindset. How would I feel here if I'm sensitive to noise? You can get a decibel reader on your phone and see how loud things are. It doesn't tell you everything, but it gives you that idea of where there's noisier and quieter parts of a classroom. So Josiah College provide us with some really lovely photos and videos of ways they've tried to reduce noise. I'm going to play little clips from their video, as well as give you some other things that we saw recommended through the research.
Josiah College is an autism-friendly school on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and it's been architecturally designed especially to cater for the sensory needs of children on the autism spectrum. Autistic children have sensory differences, so sometimes the physical environment can have a negative impact on their learning, on their well-being, on their engagement. The Josiah College environment minimises those barriers to learning and to social development through extensive collaboration with researchers, educators, the community and the architects, and through extensive research and researching best practice, we produced a school that does cater for those sensory needs. A major consideration was the acoustics of the school. When the classrooms were built, they were built with 2 layers of insulation. One outside to keep the external noise out and another inside to absorb the internal noise.
Soundproof walls are a big one because so much noise goes on around outside, but the soundproof walls muffle it so much I don't hear much at all.
The air conditioning is silent, so the usual hiss that you can hear, which you might not notice, but to an autistic person sounds like a crashing waterfall, is gone.
In a mainstream setting, it's really hard to offer the student a quiet place to work and to engage. So here at Josiah, we do offer quiet rooms and quiet spaces, which will allow the student to move into that area and actually engage quietly within their work, if that's what they required in that quiet time.
It can still feel very crowded for me, so I've taken myself outside multiple times because there's so much open space and no one's around to bother me whatsoever. We've had more quiet rooms implemented into the classroom so I can just go in there and have no noise, nothing.
Because when you design from the beginning, you can put extra insulation in and think about that. But there's other things they do about having those spaces where, proactively providing quiet spaces and making sure students have access to them. There's also a lot of things that they've implemented around visuals. So they have, and we've seen in the research around visuals, so having clearly labelled areas, but also having clear walls, or if you're going to have the displays up, making sure they link and there's a clear benefit to sort of the learning. So you can see that they've integrated lots of areas with additional space to allow touch and space. And actually people having that permission to go there during their break time and work out what works for them. Finally, around smell and temperature, so there was one of the research studies on temperature was looking at air conditioning and the impact of having air conditioning, which I know now is planned or implemented in every Queensland classroom. But actually thinking about that and speaking to people and working out what the temperature is and where the best place in the classroom is. So under the air conditioner does differ from being well away from it. Having doors open or closed, what works best for the student in your class? So there's no one size fits all, and in the infographics we provided a lot of different ideas and a lot of different suggestions to think about. But having an open, curious, inclusive mindset of providing the right environment for the students in your classroom this year, that might differ from next year, is the way that we can help create those physical and welcoming environments. So just to bring it all together, that's a lot of information, but to really kind of hone in on the key takeaways. So sensory aspects of the environment impact on learning and well-being, and there's a lot of research there to show that auditory and visual elements linked to poor auditory and visual elements of the environment linked to poorer outcomes. We need to remember the environment is changeable. We shouldn't place the onus on the student to change if we can change the environment. Setting up a classroom for success and having proactive plans or changes when possible. And I invite you each to be the one to open up the conversation and trial change. You might not think it's your job to implement change, but if you don't bring up the conversation, who will? And I'll leave you with my absolute favourite quote. And Kate looks at me every time because I'm an awful gardener, so it's quite ironic that I use this quote. But when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So nobody who's had an orchid thinks it's the orchid's fault. We all think we just didn't give the right amount of light, or the right amount of water, the right amount of anything for an orchid. We think we did something wrong, so let's have that same mindset about creating a beautiful garden for our autistic students to bloom. I think I'm going to hand over to Vicky now to summarise. There's probably time to put your questions in a chat box while Vicky provides a lovely summary.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Vicky Booth. I'm very proudly the director of the Autism Hub, the Queensland Department of Education Autism Hub. And I've been asked to just give the closing remarks today, so I know you've got lots of wonderful questions for the team here down from Griffith, so I'll be very quick. But I think it's important to share that since 2016, the Department of Education's Autism Hub has partnered with local universities to translate research, ensuring that evidence-based practice and strategies are delivered into the hands of classroom teachers. Our purpose at the Hub is to build the expertise and the confidence of school leaders and classroom teachers to include, retain and engage our autistic students in Queensland schools so they can reach their full potential. The Education Horizon grants through the Queensland Education Research Institute has provided opportunities for our team at the Autism Hub to work alongside academics to explore gaps, ask questions and build resources to build the capability of school communities in Queensland, and we're really proud to be able to do that. Many of these resources, including our Eavesdropping on Research series, can be found on the Autism Hub website, and you'll be proud to know that Dawn features very heavily in those videos. Can you join me again in thanking Dawn and the wonderful team from ACE for this work this afternoon?
No, that's a great question. So the question was, how do we help schools to identify someone's sensory profile, and how do we consider staff sensory profiles and the how that interacts? So this isn't an answer, but this is a story that someone that used in our team that used to have used to be in a school has reflected on this, and actually the fact that she lighted a class from a certain way might not have been how the students like that, and it took her quite a while to sort of come to that. Now she can talk, but we need to be introducing that as a reflection exercise for teachers. What is your profile, and how does that align with or mismatch the needs of your students, and how do we make sure we're catering for students who might have the most disadvantage from the mismatch between their environment and sensory profile? For students in schools, I'm going to defer to people that work. Is there a profile in just all students? Can they get a sensory profile, or is there? Yeah. So the students can get one, just for the people online. The responsible students can get it through occupational therapy through the department if they think the teachers would be helpful. Yeah, and asking that question, occupational therapists might just give you a report, but you can open up a conversation to say, what do we know about how this is in school? And we're trying to do that with anxiety. If you get parents to rate something, how can you give a score that goes across school and home and community, actually thinking about how things differ based on the environment. There is some work coming out of Autism Queensland as well for, Kate, I'm looking at you, but on the sensory tool.
MySense.
Great, so the MySense tool from Autism Queensland is a way that sort of like a sorting activity to work out what you prefer. Instead of a questionnaire, do you do this, and looking at responses is actually what your sensory needs are and what your sensory preferences are, rather than just focusing on a response that maybe the short sensory profile might focus more on looking at external. So open up the conversation, find out, and if lots of people already have reports for NDIS, for example, so just finding out from parents, do we have anything we can start this conversation with? And I'm sure parents would love people to ask, because there's probably a whole bucket of reports sat there at home which we just don't access. So the question was, if you have a class with mixed profiles so my thoughts around that would be not even thinking that one size will fit all. Going back to that neurowild sort of actually giving up permission for people to do different things to meet the same outcome. So if you have two children that need lots of movement and two that need, maybe some more support to sit, that's fine. And including it and building it into your activities that, okay, we've got this to do, how do we set this place up for learning for you all? And actually allowing that. We've got a quieter end of a room and a noisier end of a room. Where's best for you to sit? And actually building that in, rather than trying to find one answer, because I don't think you will, and you'll not be meeting the needs of the kids who were most challenged by their sensory profiles and just going for the norm. But Kate's an occupational therapist. I don't know if she has any other.
The other thing to consider is that just because someone might be hypersensitive to a noise, you don't have to stick them in the quiet part of the room for the whole day. So it might be when they're doing a particular activity, they need quietness. There might be other times that they're fine in the noisy environment. So just trying not to pigeonhole kids into certain parts of the room, and just recognising that for different activities, for different tasks, there might be different needs, and appreciating that and asking them, is it easier for you to work in this area or this area? You know, when you're doing this, what suits you best, on how does it help? So the suggestion was that asking the children what suits them and what they'd like, and recognising that they might need to do something. It was like snowflakes before they did a writing activity, or recognising they might need to use different utensils or different ways of writing. So I know at Ohana College near us, they have whiteboards, and they use whiteboard markers because they're a lot easier to write with than a pencil on paper. And so recognising those differences. I just want to also mention that children might know what suits them better. So asking them what do you like, they might know what the options are, and so maybe experimenting with them and giving them, let's try different ways to see what suits you.
Yeah, okay, so the response was that the facilities in terms of people that do the physical design are considering a UDL approach, universal design for learning approach, but we don't know exactly where they're up to. And I think just going back, the universal to sort of what we talked about, universal design for learning, as in creating an environment that supports as many people as possible, is good if you come from that inclusive mindset of it's about creating the environments that are really accommodating for many people, and then still allowing for individualisation on top of that. So there's not going to be one size fits all, but it's a mindset of I still need to find out what works for people. Don't think we can create one place and that will be perfect, because there'll still be diversity within it, and that is absolutely fine. Providing a permission for people within an environment to do the best that works for them. And I'm pretty sure many of us get to do that at work. So actually having those discussions and keeping the permission for diversity open, even with a UDL framework, I think, because it's not going to, we can't think we're supporting everyone and not on top of that. That's my opinion, though. That wasn't an answer on Department of Education. So when a building hasn't been specifically designed, what cost-effective strategies are there to reduce sensory overwhelm? So first of all, I think we need to just be really aware that sensory overwhelm is different for every person, different times, different places. So we can't assume anything, but what we can do is try and reduce the kind of sensory extremes, because they might be the things that are more likely to impact more people. So I love that suggestion of things, like reducing noise through sound absorbing things that might be rugs, but they might be trip hazards for people with sensory hyposensitivity and the interoception element. So it might be things on the walls might work better, like those sound absorbing things that you get, the big like circle things on the walls that absorb sound. Fluorescent lights are really, really easy to change. We bought an old Queenslander and the electrician did them in minutes. So that is something that's really easy to do and not expensive. And having lamps in places that, if you have really bright ceiling, having lamps that can be turned up and down are really cheap ways of doing that. Thinking about touch, it doesn't cost anything to stagger times for classroom in corridors. We don't have to change a building. If you think the corridor's too narrow, you can't change that. How do we change the number of people in it? How do we change the space around a desk? Some people might not need space around a desk, other people might want it. So I think going in with let's make the best of what we can do, and going with that inclusive mindset of making the environment best is the best we can do in those older buildings. But bearing in mind that we probably need to speak to people to find out what is causing overwhelm, rather than making assumptions, because you might be, especially if you have a neurotypical brain, you probably don't have the insights that many autistic people. Just ask an autistic person to walk through it and tell you. It'll be as quick as anything. Yeah. So that interaction between, if you are in an environment that people are aware is sensory unaccommodating, allowing the person to maybe take longer on the task or do it in smaller chunks or having more breaks. So adjusting the task, if you know the environment is challenging, can be another way to accommodate that balance. And even just going back to sort of how people respond if someone leaves the room, thinking about that as a way the person is actually is telling you something and not responding to it as a behaviour and saying, oh, I could see, you were trying to regulate the sensory input. How else can we do that? Labelling it as someone showing a skill rather than someone showing a behaviour. Then the person begins to learn a different response to that. Ableism is the biggest one. I think, really, assuming that everybody, anything other than the way a neurotypical brain is wrong, and therefore we should adjust people to fit to that. If you try and your implicit bias, there's a lot of things going on, but if we try and take the mindset of if you are a neurotypical person, you have a position in society where you have more brain space to make change and an opportunity to be more inclusive, rather than seeing things as extra work. That's a really hard shift to get people to do. But I think it starts with training teachers. It starts with how we talk about accommodations from school. If you want to go back, it starts with how we talk about it in society. And if we see things as great ways to be more inclusive rather than extra things, and the words we use in teacher training, for example, rather than talking about accommodations, it's about making it as accessible as possible. Then we won't have teachers seeing it as extra, we'll see them as this is all part of delivering. You've got great ideas to share with your students. How do you share them with as many students as possible? It's about accessibility. So it's a lot we can do, but it's mainly in the words we use, I think, right from the start. Yeah, okay, so the question is about, similar to, I think we had a similar one earlier about accommodating different students. So first of all, I would probably talk as a class about everybody having needs and how do we find a way for everybody to have a classroom where they can learn and have a classroom where everyone feels welcome. It might be that student doesn't need to chew gum all the time, just in certain times, and maybe we find out when that's helpful and provide warning for the other student or allow the other student to be in different places so it's a bit more predictable, because it's not just about the sensory experience, I guess it's predictability. But I think it's about, this is going to come up time and time again in life if we're going to accommodate sensory elements. So having that conversation and making it a class where everybody says, okay, how do we do this? I can pretty much guarantee you the students will come up with a solution if you empower them to say, how do we make this work? And how do we make this a place that everybody can meet their needs? I'm pretty sure all those two students will have a solution between them, which is probably more inventive than mine and might involve various things. But creating a classroom where people can talk and come up with those solutions and meet needs, I think is the first step, rather than seeing it as a problem. Seeing it as, great, we've got two students who've actually found ways that make them more able to learn and engaged. How do we create a place that they can both use them, rather than competing? And again, that's in our language, isn't it, of how we even describe the issue. So I just want to say thank you for listening, but also thank you for being the people that want to make the change. You've dedicated this time. Now is the time to go out and make things happen. This graph at the top is what happens if you do 1% change every day. 1% on 1% on 1%. Small and steady changes is what makes growth. Don't try and do 200% tomorrow. Little 1%, 1%, 1%, and then you'll make more than 100% in 100 days. And that's where I think we have to go, making small, incremental, long-lasting changes to have this more inclusive environment for autistic students. So thank you, and go ahead and do great things.